So Atomic Heart is coming out in a couple of weeks, and I'm cautiously excited about it. On one hand, it looks like it has cool combat, and the aesthetic is very appealing to me. But on the other hand, it's a small company's first game, and has a higher minimum system requirement than Cyberpunk, likely meaning that it's unoptimized and will be in a similar state as Biomutant. Considering the amount of caution that 444 skin was met with, I thought that Cyberpunk really shook people and sparked them into the idea that pre-ordering games from a relatively small company is not the greatest idea. But the majority of discussion I hear about it is praise. Similar to the video The Depth of Movie Review YouTube, I was interested in hearing a dissenting opinion that is well argued in spite of going against the grain. Instead I got this. I'll be the first to admit this. I have less investment in the Ukraine-Russia conflict than I do with the present corruption within my state, and my lack of concern when it comes to national security rivals Joe Biden's. As evident by me clicking on a bunch of short URL links instead of ones from archive.org, WikiLeaks, or the original domain of an article. Not the best step forward with a stance against spyware. I'll have to put off my journalistic dive into the credibility of his sources while I wait for his response to my comment asking about the dead links. Oh, what's this? According to him, I am a faceless, newly made bot account that he can't keep up with, despite my post being made in earnest and asking for the sources instead of questioning the narrative.
After that, their response to criticism regarding that tweet was simply to ban people, so it's a short end there.
I know that asking for trust is a lot from a right-wing troll like me, but I'd be just as willing to admit to calling Ethan Klein racial slurs on Twitter, so I hope you believe me when I say that I neither said anything about the conflict nor used any profanity in my post. So off to a bad start before I even comment on the content of the video itself. So let's start examining why I believe some of the arguments presented in this have less weight than the Herald holds them out to have. His hook was rather interesting, describing a board game from RoboCop.
That's it, Buster. No more military aid.
In celebration, the US government creates and publishes a tabletop board game called Nuclear Love, themed according to the operation performed. It was made for 2 players, where one would be playing on the side of the US, and the other would be playing as Japan. The game features dice that look like miniature atomic bombs, and the person who manages to bomb the other's city capital first wins. By rules of the game, however, the US side would always have the first turn, which brought natural advantage, and the board game, despite the patriotism and popularity, failed on the market. Sounds like a rather unethical piece of military propaganda that nullifies the tragedies, right? That's because Nuclear Love never existed, and I just made it up. But there is a similar situation that does exist that follows this formula.
Silly little guy, I already know there's a nationalistic game that empowers the United States while condemning an Axis power. It's called Wolfenstein. Seriously though, who won the Cold War? In his made-up game, the US won and made the country conform to the standards of Western democracy, and none of them have become an empire, whereas the USSR lost control of their territories, making them the equivalent of anime land in this analogy. The question in both Wolfenstein and Atomic Heart is, what if the losers won?
The game is developed by a Russian studio called Montfish. On the website of the studio, there is currently no mention of the fact that this is a Russian game dev. The story of the company begins with its launch in 2017 by a team of 4 like-minded gaming enthusiasts in Cyprus. At the same time, the studio was mentioned as a Russian one, with an office in Moscow in Russian gaming and IT media articles. In 2019, there was even a report from the Moscow office of the studio. And after the events of 2022, the company completely ostracized itself from being known as a strictly Russian company, and is now presenting itself as international, which in terms of their history of office installments and offshores means half Cyprus, half Armenian, half Singapore, and whatever the hell else, just to avoid sanctions and negative spotlight.
His next point is that Montfish is distancing themselves from Russia despite having a headquarters there, which I suppose would make them look suspicious, but considering Switzerland broke neutrality to get rid of Russian citizens' personal bank accounts regardless of their level of support for the war, it's not unreasonable to come to the conclusion that they did it because they didn't want their money and livelihoods to get taken away from them.
We do not comment on politics? You're making a game that's sole idea is USSR renewal and communism. You classified your game as inspired by Bioshock and Prey, yet you go the no politics in my video game route? This is one step away from the types of gamers who say, I don't like politics in my video game, and then immediately open up Fallout. What absolute nonsense.
The fact of the matter is, if they still have a headquarters in Russia, which means they still have co-workers and employees there, if they say that the company is not in support of Russia, pop goes their co-workers. On politics in video games, I find it weird. We haven't seen the whole game, sure, but how meaningful is an aesthetic? The original Wolfenstein games were technically political, but they didn't focus on commenting on factors of National Socialism that differentiate it from other ideologies. They just say, Nazis bad, shoot them, win. The recent ones do make race, sex, and immutable characteristics more in the forefront, but they didn't talk about the economic failures of the system, and none of them focus on why people are indoctrinated by it. Fallout is more arguable, but it doesn't show its hands and keeps itself as an RPG with characters you interact with on a personal level. It doesn't use buzzwords, and it allows the player to interpret what real-world ideology each faction represents. On top of that, the player is given the choice of who's right and who's wrong as opposed to preaching down to them. If you want to look deeper into every game you play under the guise of it being political, you can say that Mario is about the plight of the working-class Italian man at the height of the Red Scare under extremely unsafe working conditions in various blue-collar jobs, from construction to sewer inspection. BioShock is another can of worms, but the ratio of cutscenes and walking segments to gameplay in Infinite is far more than 1, and the majority of the game's story is hidden behind audio logs and are optional to listen to, meaning that the player can more aptly enjoy things unrelated to the story, such as the gameplay or the aesthetic of being in an underwater city. This is especially the case with Fallout 4 and 76, with children being able to play those games competently regardless of their grasp on the story. Everything I've said so far about politics in games applies to the normie point of view. From the viewpoint of those more engrossed in politics, they'd argue that their interpretation is right and that there's an oversight or plot hole that makes it more akin to an ideology that they're against, such as Squid Game being more representative of communism and BioShock being Malthusian propaganda. Because real capitalism hasn't been tried before. He then brings up the producers of the game, which is where I realize what my contentions with the video are.
Now, let's look at the CEO of Montfish, whose name is Robert Pagratuni. Except that it isn't. His actual name is Maxim Zatsepin.
In case you didn't know, I'm Iron-Blooded Onion, except I'm not. I'm actually Griffith. Here's a picture of Freddie Mercury, except it's not. It's actually Ferric Bulsara. Having a normal nigga name like Robert is a lot more marketable than Maximum Zaps Asperger's. I googled the name to see if he was telling the truth, and sure enough, he was. And funnily enough, just looking that up discouraged me to buy Atomic Hearts more than anything in this video. Reports of crunches and inadequate compensation for workers despite being backed by Tencent. Mr. Zapsburgers himself says the game only sells a picture and a story, so the gameplay can be neglected. This statement supports the idea that he changed his name for marketability.
Max previously had a position of a creative director slash top manager in Mail.ru, which is now presented as VK, the biggest social media platform in Russia. It doesn't take much to figure out that a platform that is based in Russia, directed and controlled by Russia, and is used only by Russians will have a strict pro-Russian stance.
And a video made by a Ukrainian, regulated by Ukrainian law, will have a Ukrainian stance, especially during wartime.
But it doesn't end there. Meet Yevgenia Sidova as the founder of Montfish. She's a former model and an owner of a modeling agency. She worked at New Media Stars, where she was in charge of the computer graphics department. That company is now in charge of various pro-Russian mass media, such as $60 for the same price as the base game. According to the former employees of the company, all Montfish transactions to checks fake footage from it.
He also mentions that there's a Russian model behind the game that worked for pro-Russian companies, but does not elaborate on their current standings with those companies, so it's kind of like saying Yuri Bezmenov is part of the KGB without elaborating on his current standings with the KGB. He then talks about how it started off as a fake game and a scam, which is completely true and I agree with wholeheartedly. Next he talks about economics, which is really weird considering that a lot of what he attributes to malice can be attributed to, not wanting people to die. He brings up investors of Atomic Heart, Tencent, GEM, and Gaijin, and states that a member of Gaijin went to Crimea under Russian occupation and has a pro-Russia stance.
The investors of the studio are Chinese Tencent and Russian GEM Capital and Gaijin Entertainment. Tencent needs no introduction, being infamous with its licensing technique and hunger over users' data. So let's start with Gaijin Entertainment, which moved from Russia to Hungary in 2022 in order to avoid conflict and continue its activities. The head of the PR, Konstantin Hovorun, illegally visited the Ukrainian Crimea, which is temporarily occupied by Russia, and repeatedly spoke in support of the policies and politics of the Russian Federation.
I'm not going to pretend that I know everything about the situation, but this is the company's statement. For all I know, they're lying through their teeth and donating all their money to Putin, but I think it's the same thing with Montfish, where they have family in Russia and don't want to get nuked by America.
GEM Capital is a Russian fund founded by Anatoly Pali, who previously worked at Gazprom's subsidiary, Gazenergosa. The studio raised investments from them in 2021, where Anatoly met and became friends with oligarchs who got rich on oil and gas activities, and now have the opportunity to invest large sums of money in various projects. Namely, the export of gas and oil is one of the main categories of income of the Russian budget, the money from which goes to the military industry. And if you know basic economics and finances, you know that all investments must be returned, including interest. Moreover, a Twitter user found Pali's connection to other Russian state institutions, such as the sanctioned, systematically important bank VTB.
So you mean to say that not only is a rich person making diversified investments, but the banks are too? Imagine my shock. It's not like that's the sole source of income for banks or anything. Demonizing a game for being funded by bad people will always strike me as a funny concept. Would a game that is supported by Nazis be more moral if liberals were to make up a majority of the shareholders? In that case, why aren't you encouraging Ukrainians to buy Montfish stock to take Russian income? Also, this means that you shouldn't watch any older Tarantino films because they're made by the Weinstein Company, yada yada yada, Samurai X, yada yada. Next, he brings up VK Play, which, fair enough, actually has sources on this. But what's funny to me about this in particular is that Xbox is also one of the publishers he mentioned. So purchasing Atomic Heart would help support Ukraine via Xbox and the banks investing in Microsoft, which will be taxed, giving even more money to Ukraine.
Lastly, there were some incredible terms of service and privacy policies spotted over at Montfish. The website now leads to a 404, but someone managed to capture these screenshots. Basically, it says that your information can and will be transferred to the Russian government, in particularly the Federal Security Service, and not just your username, but your full name, physical address, email, phone number, IP address, and so on.
He then talks about how your information will be sold to the Russian government, but there's a high chance that if you're watching this, your information is already out there on the internet, doubly so if you use your phone number for Battle.net, Discord, or any other verification. This is a bit of a nitpick, but I don't like the fact that he says IP address last, since the information you can extract from that is the... Now we're on to part 5 of the video, which is probably the worst one, and shows the media literacy of a 14-year-old.
The game is filled to the brim with USSR-themed keepsakes and memorabilia, from drinking condensed milk straight out of the can to actual flags and symbols of the USSR, hammer and sickle. This kind of approach to the showcase of USSR and communism walks a thin line between using it for world building and praising, and there are many solid reasons to believe that this line has been crossed completely right into promoting and idealizing the USSR regime and using it as a tool of USSR and Russian military propaganda.
Earlier in the video, he criticized the company for not taking a political stance, despite them calling their game BioShock in the Soviet Union. Now, given the information about the game's pitch and knowing what the creators of BioShock think of Rapture, what can we assume the views of Atomic Heart developers will be about the Soviet Union? It's really that easy to see what the creators think of the Soviet Union.
Walks a thin line between using it for world building and praising.
Fine line. It's a bold enough line to cure the blind. Not to mention the story of powerful people losing control of their assets typically portrays those people as awful. Blade Runner, Detroit, Fallout 4, practically everything involving the question of artificial intelligence that isn't Ghost in the Shell. The prevalence of a certain type of imagery is not indicative of what a game's message is. Otherwise, Jojo Rabbit and almost anything from Wolfenstein can be considered propaganda for Nazism.
Heil Hitler! Heil Hitler! Heil Hitler! Heil Hitler! Heil Hitler!
Heil Hitler.
Heil Hitler!
Heil Hitler. Heil Hitler. You know Freddy Finkel.
Heil Hitler! Heil Hitler! Heil Hitler! Heil Hitler! Heil Hitler! Heil Hitler!
Heil Hitler.
Heil Hitler!
Heil Hitler.
Heil Hitler!
In order to portray something as bad and accurately critique it in media, you have to portray it first, and accurately at that. Otherwise, it would be ineffective as a commentary, and as a result, less people would be likely to listen to you.
Take a look at this event that people behind VK organized. It was a special showcase of Atomic Heart for the Russian press, which was stylized in the game's Soviet aesthetics, and they did not go stingy on the decorations, huh? The event included a dinner in a large banquet hall where you could see Soviet-style slogans, like "Glory to the Soviet engineers" or "Comrade, join the society of the future." One of the users in Twitter replies said, "Imagine if developers of Wolfenstein had a Nazi-themed party," and I would say that's well said.
Yes, I could imagine the Wolfenstein devs having a Nazi-themed party. It would be freaking sick. Keep in mind that Disney fans are fine with the theme park having people hired to LARP as stormtroopers and actively tell them that the rebellion is bad. In case you didn't know, stormtroopers were based off of a unit of soldiers in World War I and II Germany, who served against the Allied forces. George Lucas will come up with some BS to pretend that he cared about Vietnam, but calling them the Empire instead of something similar to NATO was a bit sussy-wussy. Not to mention that would make this a better example for our purposes today, since it wouldn't just be army men from trenches, but people napalming children and innocent civilians. He praises games that take imagery from the Soviet Union and portray them as bad without taking too much from the Soviet Union, such as hammers and sickles and stars and whatnot, which I somewhat agree with. Having imagery that doesn't apply to a specific faction or place allows the player to draw more parallels to various other factions in history, but I have to ask the question once more. Do you think Wolfenstein is bad? It commonly uses Nazi imagery, and the originals portray Nazis as good scientists to the point where they have a moon base 25 years before the actual moon landing and 40 years before the Challenger went boom boom. The creator himself tells supposedly intolerant potential viewers to play COD, a series that frequently uses imagery from the real-life factions that committed atrocities, including the Nazis and the Soviet Union. However, I think the best game to bring up to counter this is BioShock. It frequently uses imagery from Atlas Shrugged and makes a lot of references to Ayn Rand. Again, it doesn't use buzzwords or illusion, but if the player is invested in these topics, they would be able to recognize it immediately. Now, on to the sixth and final chapter. I agree that Mundfish is using sexploitation in order to sell their game. The biggest problem I have with this section is that he brings up the 6 hours scene, as though the community has anything to do with the production of the game itself. He brought up Elden Ring earlier in the video, and it's rather odd that he knows about the 6 hours scene and not the Ronnie Jar or 4-hand stuff. Overwatch and League of Legends are also infamous instances of sexualizing women made by Western people who claim to be feminist, though I suppose it's because they sexualize every character equally. But after this, what happened next cracked me up like a beer bottle to a woman's face.
Not only is marketing like this highly unethical and immoral, as we've been fighting with objectifying and sexualizing women, especially in media and advertisements, especially lesbians, but it's also actually illegal. For example, in Ukraine, our parliament adopted a law banning sexism in advertising, which became active in January 2022. If you want to go a step further, you can do the following. You can go to the game's shop page, click on the complaint flag, select the item breach of the law, contains materials that violate the laws of your country, and write a similar text or something on that matter. In case you didn't know, Ukraine has implemented a law that restricts and bans all Soviet and USSR propaganda, symbols, and memorabilia. We had quite enough of that.
He knows that he's reaching an English-speaking audience, which is extremely broad, and yet he encourages them to flag the game for violating the laws of his own country. World police much? That would be the equivalent of me saying that advertisements having lesbians making sex in it should be allowed in Ukraine because America allows it. In his conclusion, he says that it's a matter of morals whether or not you play the game, regardless of whether you're pirating it or not.
Some users could make a claim that they could simply pirate it and pay no money to the Russian devs and still enjoy the game. To that I can't say anything. At that point it depends only on your moral compass. If you feel comfortable playing the game after watching this video till the end, I've done all in my power and I can't control your wallet, so I can't stop you from pirating this game. It's just up to your morals and ideals at this point.
For someone who has a segment in a video called Economics, he sure does not know anything about it. If you do not give money to a company, that money will not receive money from you. By that token, people who are pirating this game will not be giving any money to Russia. All of this talk, and we still haven't answered the main question of whether or not you should buy Atomic Heart, but the answer will vary from person to person. My answer is a no because I'm saving up for a car and I just bought something for someone else. On top of that, it has higher system requirements than Cyberpunk, which is said to take 24 hours to beat, whereas this game is said to take 25 hours, likely meaning that there are also more bugs to be ironed out later in the updates, and it's probably poorly optimized as well, making it safer to buy it later. At a security risk, any website knows your IP from connecting to it unless you have a VPN, and Steam probably has your credit card information and address, unless you exclusively use key sites, in which case those key sites have that same information. This may seem extremely dismissive, and fair enough. I made my first Google account after Xkeyscore was known to the public. But again, if you're able to interact this by likes, dislikes, or commenting, you already forfeited a lot of your information, which shows you're equally as apathetic. Now on to some other meat and potatoes, the legality of the video. The poster claims to be from Ukraine, and I'll take that at face value, but that means that by showing Soviet imagery, he knows he's breaking Ukrainian law. This means that we can take the video down if we wanted to, but that begs another question. Couldn't Mundfish just get a VPN and do the same? What incentives does Mundfish have to not take down his video? Not only is it illegal, but it also disparages the company. According to me, they do it with the incentive of not looking bad, as doing so would look incriminating and basically be admitting to all the claims put forward, but I'm curious about the logic of Harenko, seeing as his video could be seen as manufactured dissent, coupled with the fact that he got over 1 million views overnight. I'm not saying that Harenko is an AI-generated voice that uses samples of Zelensky getting pegged by a twink, but I am saying that you should not buy Atomic Heart day one. Get Xbox Game Pass instead because it's way cheaper, you dumbass.